So with that, that's all you're going to have to listen to me. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to our friends at Protiviti and let them kick off our event for this afternoon. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jeff with Protiviti and let him take over from here. So whenever you're ready, Jeff. Looks like you're on mute, Jeff.
Sorry about that. Yes. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today and taking some time to have us talk about this topic. Go through some introductions. I'll introduce myself and then turn it over to TJ, Dara, and Matt. So again, Jeff Strain, coming to you from Charlotte, a managing director in our technology service and delivery practice, covering DevOps. I also cover tech consulting for our Charlotte office and for many of our large accounts. So that's across all of our technology consulting solutions. I've worked in this space from a consulting standpoint for my entire career, about 26 years. And again, look forward to talking with you today, learning more about what you're looking for and make sure we're addressing your questions. Thanks. TJ, over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is TJ Mann. I am the Chief Information Security Officer at Children's Mercy, Kansas City. And if you're not familiar with Children's Mercy, it's 2 hospitals, 23 sites. We have a research center, and we're actively bringing in a lot of researchers right now to advance our research academic institute. As part of my role, I'm responsible for overall cybersecurity strategy and leadership for the entire organization. Excited to be here to share some of my insights on open source software, program management and development, and how that integrates with cybersecurity and some of the challenges as we work with Protiviti to help define that for us. So thank you for having me.
I'll introduce myself. I'm Dara O'Grady. I'm an associate director working with Protiviti out of the New York office. I've spent over 30 years working in organizations from startups through to global financial institutions. A lot of work around enterprise architecture and engineering management, compliance, and automation around the DevOps space. So I am a certified AWS Professional Solution Architect. I'm also certified in TOGAF and SAFE, which are certifications around enterprise architecture and scaled agile delivery. So hopefully this will be a very insightful conversation for everyone joining today. Over to you, Matt.
Perfect. Thanks, Dara. My name is Matt McVeigh. I am a manager in Protiviti's healthcare technology strategy practice. I'm based here in Dallas, Texas. For the past 6 years, I've been heavily involved in the healthcare revenue cycle and IT space. So dealing mainly in IT and revenue cycle assessments and transformation efforts across major US health systems. And additionally, with a strong risk and compliance background, have served as the SME on several DevOps implementations at several leading US health systems and a large technology service organization. So happy to be here and kind of tie in the technology and meaning behind DevOps to healthcare systems and the direct impact they'll have. So.
Okay, with that, we're going to do our first poll of today. As you've learned a little bit about us, we'd like to learn a little bit about you and your role in the organization. So hopefully you're able to I guess, click on the different aspects in this poll and we can see, who's all on the presentation today. We can get some real-time updates here.
Are people able to connect?
Okay, it's coming through in the chat. Looks like we're not able to connect.
Page not found, one of our users has, so hopefully PolyV is not having outage issues. We may just have to skip this and see if we can, hopefully it'll resolve itself before too long.
Looks like we're getting a page not found. And we have a couple of polls we were going to go through today, so we can work on getting this working when we get to the next poll. Should we go ahead and move forward? Interest of time. Okay. So next, as we get into today, we're kind of, I'll call it start from a higher level and dig into it. So as many of you may be familiar, when we look at development of software, in the past, there was a framework around system development lifecycle, which had a series of steps that you went through around understanding requirements and designing and building and testing and rolling that out. A methodology that was used over some time known as waterfall. It's kind of a linear approach, as you can see in the model, and it's like a waterfall, right? So you have to almost complete each portion of that before you start the next one. Somewhat recently, although it's been underway for a while, and I've worked with a lot of companies on moving from waterfall to agile. It's a very iterative approach, right? So you're going through quicker cycles and rolling stuff out faster. And there's different aspects, not just on the timing of that and having that happen quicker, but also the people that are involved. So the teams that are built around agile, people are more involved along the way. So each one of these iterations and the concepts of where you're getting your requirements from and who's building that and who's going to run it and how you operate it, and continuing to go through that cycle, people are more involved along the way. And to me, that really drives where you think of the concepts of DevOps coming together. So all these individuals are more integrated in how they work together. And today we're going to talk about that as well as alignment to open source software. Next slide.
All right, perfect. So kind of breaking the mold and seeing how DevOps is directly applicable to healthcare organizations. So for a lot of the folks on the call, I mean, as the slide says, and as Jeff has got us started on, DevOps is a combination of both cultural evolution, process efficiency, and technology standardization. And it's going to build on that agile methodology and create a seamless integration and collaboration across IT and business to improve and accelerate delivery of business results while maintaining and managing risk and security and compliance concerns. It's important to reiterate that we aren't just talking about a shift in the technology used to support the software development lifecycle, but also really changing how our organization approaches process improvement to something that is active and continuous, and something that all of our process stakeholders are continuously thinking about, not just those who traditionally have handled direct change management. And talking about how some practical examples and in the improvements that we're going to see from a DevOps tech stack and methodology is that it's going to allow us to rapidly respond to patient workflows, and it's going to enable the consistent thinking of how can we improve that end-to-end movement and integrity of a patient account and the information that we're capturing from the patient along that whole patient life cycle. It's going to empower your developers to make active real-time impact on care delivery. We're getting them more engaged and also making these positions more appealing by making the process, the change management process in itself, less inundated with cumbersome and less effective practices. It's going to change your organization's mentality on the status quo. So again, it's going to redefine process improvement and brings about continuous improvement and empowers our employees from everywhere from your back-end builders to your department presidents to consistently think of and implement changes that increase the effectiveness of our processes. And the whole organization is going to be involved in this mental shift. You're going to be able to automate cumbersome parts of traditional change management, like developing, deployment, and testing, things that traditionally have a lot of red tape and take a lot of time. And it's going to leverage automated technology and thought processes to automate those and bring those about more quickly to, again, enable that continuous movement and shift of change and process improvement. It's also going to ensure that with that automation and this automated testing and tech stack that we do have, that security and compliance risks and concerns are baked in. So that's been, with the rise in automated technologies, there's a lot of hesitation in the healthcare space simply because of that concern around security and compliance regulations, and we're able to bake that in to automated tests and processes as part of the overall DevOps lifecycle. So we can move on to the next slide. I think that we're going to go ahead and skip past the polling unless we got it to work again.
Yeah, so I think we'll try again this time and see if it works.
Let's give it a go. So the question is, what is your experience level with agile methodology and or DevOps? All right, looks like we're working. Okay, perfect. So it looks like the majority of our attendees do have some familiarity with DevOps. In fact, everybody does. Where we're going to vary is, direct experience within the industry, and that's good because the next few slides we're going to spend and talk about direct healthcare specific examples of how DevOps can augment process improvement and change management. All right, so let's talk about patient workflows. So DevOps is going to enable us to continuously improve our patient workflow and rapidly respond to workflow issues and breaks. Think of problematic workflows associated with a patient account that your organization deals with, those that require immediate attention when failing or not working correctly. Things like allocating medicine, patient surveys, coordinating patient care plans, patient transfers to other facilities. ADT notifications are a huge thing because of the recent final rule. Medical record updates, help desk requests. I mean, the list really goes on. That's not an exhaustive list, but there are a lot of different workflows that feed into the main patient workflow that we really need to rely on to get accurate and reliable data from our patients to avoid having to call them more on the back end to capture it later on. And that's why they're critical components in delivering a consistent continuum of care to our patients. Because of this, each workflow needs to run smoothly and without error in delivering the highest quality of care to your patients. We also are dealing with rapidly evolving rules from ONC and CMS that require the constant improvement of these workflows. Combination of DevOps practices and tools allow developers to rapidly develop changes as needed. They go through a series of, again, those immediate and automated tests, and it's going to avoid those traditional cumbersome barriers to change. Ultimately, if we're making these changes rapidly, empowering our developers, we're resulting in less breaks when we do make changes, and we're allowing continuous improvement to our patient workflows, which again is going to ultimately deliver a higher level of care to our patients and a stronger patient experience. On the digital patient experience side, so these words are not lost on anybody on the call. With COVID last year, patient portals, telehealth platforms, all these different ways for our patients to engage with us remotely and immediately have been adopted by basically every healthcare system in the United States in some capacity. Patient portals and telehealth platforms require the consistent integration of scheduling, billing, and clinical systems, and we've essentially just introduced this whole new component to our pre-existing tech stacks. Considering the many interfaces these systems have with other applications and system components, the need for reliable and continuous integration is again imperative. Just as a practical example from my personal experience, a client of ours was in the process of implementing their own telehealth platform, and again, it was rapidly pushed forward as COVID-19 ramped up last year. And the intent was to support the rising demand of telehealth appointments. However, the iterative nature of in-house software development and the tech stack needed to integrate this homegrown tool with the rest of the environment led to the development of an in-house DevOps team. They leverage DevOps strategies and tools to enable their team to make rapid, well-tested changes to their homegrown solution, making it an environment where they could consistently find ways to improve the platform without fear of downtime. And again, that's a continuous process, so it's still occurring here today, a year later. So we can move on to the next slide. So while those examples were more operation in nature, we're going to talk about some of those that are going to speak closely to our chief financial officers, chief revenue officers, anybody that's really dealing on the revenue side of things and back-end management. So talking about cash acceleration, when you think of cash acceleration, the first thing that's probably going to come to your mind from a rev cycle perspective is things like cumbersome additional documentation requests that payers solicit, back-end authorization issues, or the discovery of patient eligibility information issues on the back end. So non-exhaustive list, but some key issues that, often again lead to a delay in cash flow. There are some solutions to alleviate these concerns, and automation has definitely become one of the key players in this space. Whether it's the automation of pre-existing workflows or the introduction of a third-party automation platform that augments your tech stack, we again kind of find ourselves in an instance where rapid changes need to be enabled to reflect the needs of the business and to make sure that these workflows aren't breaking, or if they do, that they're fixed quickly. Instead of needing to wait on a monthly change cycle, we can implement solutions to our backend workflows as soon as problems or opportunities for improvement are identified. And again, want to highlight that opportunities, because we're not just looking to change that mindset of just fixing what is broken, and more of a mindset of continuously thinking how we can improve these workflows and make them more efficient. And additionally, in going through this process, we're going to have peace of mind knowing that these changes have been, again, subjected to automated testing that are not only, again, we're not only worried about addressing those operational needs, right, but addressing those critical regulatory and compliance concerns as well that are baked into our testing efforts. And then lastly is another example. So for revenue integrity, every hospital that I have worked with or been at has had a different approach to revenue integrity. In fact, the meaning of that is often a little ambiguous. Whether it's missing charge reviews, charge capture, or proactive denial and analysis, hospital systems have developed a lot of different homegrown practices and sometimes homegrown systems to address the rising complexity of billing, and making sure that we're capturing and getting paid for revenue and charges correctly. Again, the automation of pre-existing workflows or the introduction of third-party tools has certainly become common practice in this space. But when we're introducing a third-party tool, such as an automation tool, DevOps can be used to rapidly make changes and support the continuous improvement of that workflow and current state process. It's going to lead to lower error reduction and improved clinical documentation, and it's going to make our charge audits and charge capture much more effective. And again, it's going to be getting everybody at every level of that. So, folks on the charge review team, all the way up to our AVPs over that department, thinking about, hey, how can we make this process better? How can we continuously improve it? It's going to empower our developers to have a say in that too, so that not only we're thinking about improving consistently, but we're bringing about those changes quickly so that our patients can see the end result. So there, I'm going to pass it on to you for the next slide.
Thank you, Matt. So in this one, we'll talk about some of the concerns that CIOs and CISOs have with respect to delivering technology in modern organizations. So from a CISO perspective, the key areas here are security, privacy, and compliance. And we'll go into these in a fair bit of detail in the coming slides. But essentially, the challenge is to try and make sure that the technology that you're delivering is always going to meet expectations around security, around the privacy requirements that are increasingly being adopted across the US, and compliance and regulatory requirements. So while at the same time maintaining speed and agility. And I think this is the real challenge that a lot of organizations have, where they see the security and privacy and compliance concerns acting as a sort of a constraint to productivity. But DevOps is really a way to mitigate that and to maintain that agility without compromising those characteristics. The second thing, from a CIO perspective, the CIO's main challenge is around this, how frequently they can deliver solutions to the client, because that is really how a lot of CIOs are judged. And so there's various different mechanisms that can be used in terms of the development process to accelerate that. And DevOps techniques are really key enablers, leveraging automation, but also some best practices around how you develop and engineer software throughout the whole life cycle. So we'll go into some of that in some detail as well in the coming slides. So now I think we'll do another poll. So let me know if let me know if that one's working. If people can try that one. We want to see, what is your biggest challenge area where you think DevOps could help you and or your department. All right, we're getting inputs. So tech modernization seems to be a key theme. Security and privacy compliance is not a huge concern for folks attending here. Okay, excellent. So I think we've got a pretty good sense here of what kind of things this audience is particularly interested in. And you know, I think, you know, respect to modernization allows you to achieve those other concerns as well. So I think they're all kind of connected. So so that's good to know. All right, so we'll move on to the next section here. So what is the DevOps lifecycle? So there are a number of phases in the DevOps lifecycle. I'll go through them here, but in many cases, what DevOps is really focused on is that part of the process which starts from when code has been committed into a code repository. So whereas Agile really focuses on what the requirements are and what tasks need doing and managing that, DevOps is really focused on the point of commit to the point that actually the software gets out into the hands of users. Now that is the point at which value is being delivered. And so a real goal of the whole DevOps processes is to minimize, among other things, is to minimize the amount of time it takes between getting that code into the repository to the point in time it's out in production and delivering value, and making sure that in that process that it's high quality, it's secure, it does what's needed, and it's maintainable and sustainable in the long run. So these steps are essentially, it starts with the planning, which is your typical Agile process. Goes into code, which is where you commit code to the repository, and that's in any kind of programming language essentially is in that section, but it could also include configuration, which these days folks might be familiar with tools like JSON and YAML, which are configuration languages. And they can be very sophisticated in terms of how they're used for configuration and getting very, very close to being code themselves. Then you have build, which is the process of taking code and creating deployable artifacts. And so a deployable artifact, you know, traditionally used to be an executable file that you might, you know, run on a machine. Modern deployable artifacts are looking more like containers, but it could easily be a tar file or zip file or, you know, something like that could be deployed onto a machine. But the point is that it is a deployable artifact. The next phase then is to test that against objectives. Now, as within the build, there are unit tests. There are certain tests that happen during build that developers do as part of the build process. But the test process after build is really testing to make sure that the software in its deployed environment meets various different quality criteria. And so obviously it meets basic things like quality assurance, user acceptance testing, but there's a variety of non-functional types of tests that could happen there as well. So that would include various different security tests, compliance tests. In cloud, you might have a lot of different tests to make sure that your software is compliant with cloud standards and guidelines. And you may have performance tests and scalability tests, resilience. You could have a lot of tests in the test phase, and that's really defined per application, per pipeline. Then what you do is once the artifacts pass all the tests, it goes into the release phase, which essentially prepares it for release to say this is now ready to be deployed. The deployment process basically moves that artifact into an environment configured for that environment so that it can run. Operate is running that software in that environment and all that entails. And monitoring is essentially making sure then closing that feedback loop to look at what's happening while that software is running and feeding that back into the plan phase where there might be issues that might need to be addressed that the monitoring is highlighting. So it really is trying to break down that barrier between what traditionally developers would create something and toss it over the wall to the operations folks who then try to figure it out and try to run it. And that mode of software worked well for certain environments, but in the modern environment where increasingly software is being run on a you build it, you run it kind of basis, where you got software as a service, or you're not doing your traditional building software and then sending it out on disk like you used to do many years ago. So this is a much more modern way of approaching software development. So within Protiviti, there's a lot of different the basic core DevOps model, which is you'll see this around the internet. It's a fairly common sort of meme, if you like, around DevOps, that sort of infinity symbol that shows how all these things are connected. But within Protiviti, what we try to do is use the basic DevOps as a scaffolding for security and for compliance and risk. These are key areas for a lot of organizations which are increasingly finding that even while they go fast, or they're trying to go fast with DevOps and Agile, that the challenges of trying to make sure that their software is always secure and always compliant and always managing risk is increasingly challenging. And so you can see in the various different phases, there's a lot of different type of things that can be done from a security perspective, where you're looking at threats, you're monitoring for securities, you're checking for vulnerabilities, you're doing all kinds of static and dynamic tests, you're doing identity and access management tests to make sure that you're not breaking concepts like least privileged access, and code scanning, because all the software developed these days has lots of different components, and a lot of them are open source, which we'll talk to later, and they all have vulnerabilities over time that people can identify and find vulnerabilities of the software, which can expose your environment to risk. And so it's always a case of constantly checking to make sure that all your software is as secure as it can be. And then on top of that and around risk management and compliance, it's not only about the software being secure, but also that you can demonstrate that it complies with these regulatory expectations for various different rules around how your software should be made secure. And there's a lot of different standards and frameworks out there, like NIST and CIS and various things like that, which basically recommend these are the basic checks you need to do to demonstrate that you're meeting a certain level of security and compliance. And all these things can be automated into the DevOps cycle. I think historically in a traditional waterfall cycle, you would have had a separate team who would have been told there's a deliverable due at a certain point in time. They're given a week or 2 weeks to look at it and review it and assess it and say, okay, this ticks all the boxes, or to push it back and say, no, there's some remediation needs to be done. All those kinds of delays impact agility, because essentially development teams might get told about issues that happen 2-3 weeks or a month after they wrote the code, and so they have to figure out, well, what was I trying to do and what do I have to do to fix this? So all that slows down productivity. So the idea of DevOps is to move a lot of this stuff left, which is to say closer to when the code is written, so that the time between when the developer identifies or is told that there is an issue and the time that they're finished working on it is shorter and shorter. Ultimately, ideally, with every code they write in the terminal, they'll be told whether there's an issue there and then. But there's a certain amount of that in there today in IDEs. But there's so many things to check that really a lot of this happens in the post-build test phases. So then looking at security specifically, the big challenges that a lot of organizations have really around cloud is a significant one. And cloud is a big enabler for agility for all kinds of reasons, because the time obviously to provision infrastructure is that much shorter. And so you don't want to have your infrastructure being provisioned, in a matter of seconds, but your software taking weeks to be provisioned. That would kind of eliminate a lot of the benefits. But cloud comes with issues and concerns around security. There's a lot of different ways you can expose yourself. Everyone's heard about a lot of different breaches that have happened out there, most of them involving S3 buckets or the like, and on AWS and what have you. But there are a lot of ways that cloud can expose your security. But on the other hand, there are a lot of ways that you can make it secure because you can use technology to provide that assurance. Standards are also really important, because with the more standards you have, then the better you can sort of roll out these security checks across an enterprise and remove the load from developers from having to worry about this stuff themselves. And I think that's a big challenge, because application teams really should be focusing on the business applications and the business value, and not have to worry about all the different rules and constraints and requirements that they have that from a security perspective. And I think that a challenge is as well, security is seen as a roadblock. It gets in the way of timely deployment of solutions. And so we want to get away from that and basically have security being, well, here's another dimension of quality, but in the same token, that it shouldn't introduce any more friction to the development and release process. And today, if you look at the survey, the GitLab survey, it says 42% noted that security testing occurs too late in the CI/CD process. Now, the CI/CD process is called continuous integration, continuous delivery, and it's a means of getting software from code into an environment for as quickly as possible. So it's a streamlined process called CI/CD. Security testing happens too late, which means that feedback back to developers can be days or weeks after that code was written, and obviously before it gets to production. So, so really, it's really about DevOps is trying to get that closer to when the development actually occurs. 64% of companies have no security capabilities for cloud native and serverless technologies. So as firms adopt these technologies, then they need to adopt their security processes to take advantage of them. DevOps offers a variety of different means to ensure that that just when you adopt these technologies, that you're not slowing down your development process, that you're getting secure implementations as quickly as you can. The Cloud Security Alliance has a lot of standards around securing cloud, which is definitely worth looking at it. Again, a lot of these can be automated in the DevOps cycle. And there's a DevSecOps maturity model that OWASP has, which essentially establishes the minimum standards for an enterprise program for DevSecOps. And DevSecOps is really just highlighting the security aspect of DevOps. There are a number of checks that need to be done in the DevOps cycle. That security is obviously a very big one. It's not the only one. So we tend to use DevOps just because there's also financial concerns. For example, if you're using cloud, then you want to make sure that your solutions or architecture are not going to break any cost constraints, for example. So there are a lot of different types of checks you can do, and security is a big one. From a compliance perspective, the interesting thing about compliance is really about understanding what is expected and being able to demonstrate how well your software is meeting those expectations. And this typically is a big concern for organizations which have second and third level risk management. So for second line risk, audit folks and regulators often come in and do an exam, and they want to know, are you compliant? And a lot of work goes into pulling together evidence to show that you are compliant. So a big opportunity that DevOps offers is to enable firms to be DevOps or to be audit ready at all times. And this is a key consideration. Essentially, whenever you're told that there's an audit planned or that a regulator is doing an exam, there shouldn't be any panic. It should be like, yeah, okay, no change. We just continue doing what we're doing because we're audit ready and we have all the data there and everything is there. And you just point the auditors where they need to go, and then they can see all the information. Now, most organizations don't have that luxury. Usually an audit takes a lot of work, a lot of data gathering, a lot of documentation creation or updating. So really a lot of this work is really about trying to make sure that audit readiness, that the tests are there, that there's records of what tests have happened, of what decisions were made for every artifact that was deployed to production. So throughout the whole life cycle. And so you can demonstrate that for the various control points you have in your workflow, there's evidence that those controls happened and were executed. You're really trying to maximize your SDLC flow so that it all happens in the pipeline and developers get to know quickly when something is failing a test that they need to fix. It can be adaptive in the sense that as more regulations and requirements come in and there's different tests that you can implement to validate them, then you can add these to the pipeline without slowing things down. And ultimately, over time, I think one of the biggest challenges, and this is not something that's easily solved, for any tool that you get which checks your compliance against various different standards, you could find a lot of gaps. You could find hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of gaps that your software may have, and often that can be quite intimidating. And so a lot of judgment might need to be used in order to say, okay, well, we can't fix all of these, so we'll fix the most important ones or the critical ones. And sometimes that takes a bit of judgment as well, because the cost to fix them could be quite high. And so there's a risk that needs to be carried over. And sometimes you just have to accept the risk and make sure that there's a process around that. And sometimes the risk cannot be accepted and must be fixed. So this is where AI can come in and help with that process to really understand what is the real risk and make that call or help teams make that call so that the deployments can happen without everything having to be 100% ticking all the boxes. So it'll be a risk appropriate decision making. And then finally, significant concerns around privacy. And privacy is it's a growing concern. I think the challenge is how you embed that in your development process so that you can catch breaches or potential breaches of privacy laws and regulations as early as possible. Now, there are certain aspects of privacy that are handled by privacy by design, which means that the whole privacy considerations are embedded into the requirements setting process. But also parts of it are embedded in the software development and testing process. And so you have things like the OWASP top 10 privacy risks, which really identifies what are the key areas in software that typically could be in breach of privacy regulations. And these are things that you can test for, that you might be able to build tests to make sure that you're not inadvertently breaking those various different laws. And so this is a new space. I think for health in particular, privacy is a huge concern, and I think that the peace of mind that you can put in place by having automated DevOps processes could be quite significant. I think it'll really become an issue when more regulations kick in. There's more data service access requests or data subject access requests, which are these DSARs, which are basically the rights of individuals to request the information that an organization has in them. And so, understanding where you've got obligations and where you haven't is something that every team is going to have to deal with. And then finally, just looking at platform considerations, as you might expect from all this, DevOps cannot be implemented with just a single tool. It really is a whole universe of different tools that cover different aspects of DevOps, and they all have different capabilities. They all have different strengths. They all might be super for particular architectures and different organizations. And so figuring out what is the right tools for a given team or given organization can be a challenge. A lot of these tools also are very much personal preference for individual developers or development teams, where they may have an attachment to specific tools in terms of their productivity. So it can get quite emotional debates about what tools should be used. But at the end of the day, organizations really want to empower their teams to do what needs to be done, and looking at the different aspects of the platform. So what is the tool strategy? How you decide what tools to use, which teams should use which tools, how they should be integrated, all that is pretty significant. Tool governance, making sure the tools are being used effectively, that people know how to use them, and that they're maximized in terms of meeting all the different organizational needs of the tools. There's a lot of training that needs to happen to make sure that people understand their how they should work within a DevOps environment or an agile environment which has DevOps capabilities built into it. A significant part of the DevOps is around dependencies management. That's becoming more and more important, and we'll talk about that as well in the context of software supply chain assurance. So dependencies in terms of system dependencies, but also dependencies in terms of component dependencies. These all, there's a lot of things you can build into DevOps to make sure that as you build and test your software, that you're minimizing the risk that some of these dependencies might have changed that could break something. And finally, orchestration, which is essentially how you manage all these different tools to, end to end, so that they're all working harmoniously together. This is an interesting space. I think there are tools like Jenkins, for example, and you got tools like digital AI coming in there. And digital AI, and tools like that are looking at value streams. They're looking at the whole end-to-end process, not just at the technical build side. And so they're recognizing that there are pieces that need to be orchestrated that development teams themselves may not be directly responsible for. So it's a bit of a growing space there around really what the role of orchestration tools is. And I think then we should move on to our next poll. Let's see if this works. So what is your level of concern regarding the risks around the use of open source software in your organization? So this is a segue for TJ to introduce us to open source software governance. So TJ, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, thanks, Tara. Interested in what the audience thinks about this question. Wow, everybody is pretty mature. Okay, that's great. All right, the next slide, please, Tara. Oh, wait, I think we're getting some more responses. Okay. Okay, good. So it sounds like half the folks, their organizations are looking into supply chain risks, and others feel that they're pretty mature. That's good. That's good news. Just continuing the conversation from Dara around managing security, risk, and compliance as you think about building and developing open source software programs in your organizations. As I mentioned earlier, Children's Mercy partnered with Protiviti to develop this framework, which I'll go into a little bit of overview here today, just to share how we looked at this challenge and how we approached this challenge and what did we build. So really, when it comes to understanding the needs of open source software from a healthcare institution perspective, we obviously have developers developing code. And then we also have researchers at our institution who really have these research grants, and they have a time-based initiative to use some kind of application or open source software to conduct their research. Or they may also be using they're also in the middle of a research, and they may have a need to quickly analyze some data that they have. And they found an open source software that can do the statistical analysis very quickly, or they are collaborating with a different research organization that is using that kind of open source software to perform some activity and some function for that data set that they have. So they're very inclined towards rapidly being able to download something and able to use it to get their job done, or just really understand, is this the right kind of tool for me or not? So that really brings some challenges from a security standpoint. And when it comes to our objectives for creating and building an open source program, obviously we wanted to make sure that we have visibility and awareness into free and open source software anywhere within the organization. Just as you'd have a hardware inventory or you'd have a software inventory, it's critical to have an inventory of all the open source software that your organization may be using. And then efficiency to minimize the amount of time the teams are spending on onboarding new programs, because as I said, and most times they're in crunch time. They need something very quick. They need something very quick to do a specific piece of the entire job. They'll get done and they'll move them to the next step of the completion of their job. And obviously security is a big component of it, with reacting and quickly reacting to the vulnerabilities in FOSS and open source programs and the open source components that we would depend on. And then licensing is a big piece where we know that legal departments are very interested in making sure that we're not getting into any licensing conflicts with the use of certain applications or open source programs. And then from an organizational quality and safety perspective, we need to make sure that the code that the developers are writing or the code that they're using and embedding in their overall development by using open source libraries ensures the quality and has appropriate support for the applications and the enterprise applications that they may be contributing towards. Next slide, please. And really, when you start thinking about what does this all mean, right, and how do we start thinking about it, really these 5 pillars give a high-level overview of the thought process behind building an open source program. And it all starts with governance, right? You got to have a formal program office. You got to have policies and guidelines that define what is a consistent approach for adopting and managing free and open source software across the organization. And you got to have some kind of lifecycle management, as I mentioned, cataloging that free and open source software to make sure that we understand we are only using allowed software and software that has been vetted and gone through the various security and legal checks. And then onboarding and management to have some kind of ability for users to onboard and be able to use that free and open source software in a consistent approach. And then when it comes to vulnerability management, understanding the existing security vulnerabilities that may be present in that in a particular code library or in a particular open source software that the organization is intending to use, and keeping in mind the needs of the various stakeholders that may be using that free and open source software, so they can rapidly go along and security does not become a hindrance in their business processes, and having some kind of exception process for less risky FOSS applications or areas where we need to accept the risk and continue forward. And then I talked about license compliance. Legal plays a big role here, developing standards and agreements on what kind of licensing is allowed and what kind of licensing we're going to object on. And then technology automation will really help accelerate this all forward, because doing all this manually is going to be time consuming. And there are, ironically enough, there are free and open source softwares that can help with that. And there are some standard off the shelf commercial products that can also help with that. Next slide, please. So this is an interesting slide because it kind of shows not only where you may be thinking of getting to, but it shows where you can get to also. Most organizations are consumers of free and open source software. They may be developing code, and developers may be using code libraries which may have open source components, or there may be needs for specialized open source software for mathematical or statistical analysis that the organizations may want to use. So that is our target operating model at Children's Mercy. But then you can also, the next level up would be a contributor, where you can contribute to strategic open source projects as an organization, where you may want to contribute to the bigger initiatives and bigger projects in the community. And then being a leader is the top level model for this, where a company doesn't just consume or contribute to open source projects, but they take a leadership role in developing an open source project. And this really comes after once you've mastered being a consumer, being a contributor. Now you're thinking of, hey, you know, we want to be a leader and contribute to the open source community by leading certain projects. Next slide, please. And to make all this work, you need an open source governance framework. And at the bottom, the chevrons, the activities that are listed there are the key activities that this governance framework should support. Acquisition being identifying, selecting, and sourcing open source software. This is usually a decentralized operation. Licensing being legal being involved, and contracting being involved in case we need to establish and manage usage terms and agreements. That's usually centralized. And then supporting the open source lifecycle with from security standpoint with regular vulnerability scanning and deploying the deployment of open source softwares to make sure that the users who need those open source softwares have that available as soon as an immediate need and as soon as they need it. And it's really divvied up into setting up a program office, it's setting up a review board. The program office focusing on the strategy, vision, policies, standards, and procedures on acquisition, licensing, support, and deployment of open source software. And what is the standard criteria of vetting new open source programs and components that are coming in? What is allowed and what is not going to be allowed? And having a full inventory of approved open source software, including the license information and who's using that particular open source software. That's kind of like the high level vision and strategy group. Then you have a review board, which will establish objectives and metrics to support the team collaboration. And this really is divided into people, process, and technology, where you need to have clearly defined roles and responsibilities. You need to have a process that's in accordance with the policies defined by the program office and aligned with an overall architectural review board for future integrations. And tools for interim and long-term that will allow this entire process to seamlessly execute. So I know in the interest of time, Dara, is there a next slide? I think. Yeah, so we're going to the poll here. I'll pass it off to Jeff. You're in mute, Jeff.
Oh, sorry about that. So yeah, in closing, we were curious, what do you need to get started or to take the next step with DevOps or OSS? Okay, so hopefully people today was helpful and maybe generate some questions that could lead to some discussions. Some people are very, very well off on the topic and feel good.
Jeff, I'm not sure if you're answering any questions. I have a question here specifically for me.
Okay.
Around what is CMH's primary EMR vendor in that center for us?
Okay. So in closing, again, thanks for the time today. Just a little bit about Protiviti. If you didn't know, Protiviti is a global organization, quick growing. Actually, if you look at this 18, we did 1.4 billion last year in revenues. Global company, 75 plus offices, and we're now over 7,000 professionals. Again, a professional services firm. We cover all aspects, not just of technology consulting and DevOps, but also have internal audit, risk and compliance, and business process and improvement. Next slide. So again, we have a very broad and deep DevOps services. Hopefully you saw some of that today. And it's part of our technology consulting solution set that covers technology strategy and operations, security and privacy, enterprise application solutions, aka ERP, emergent technology, software services, and enterprise data and analytics. So again, this is a component of that. Thanks everyone for joining today. Here's some contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out, and we look forward to hearing from you and having future conversations. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. Thank you to our friends at Protiviti, our speakers as well. Really appreciate your time today. And again, if you guys have any follow-up questions that you'd like to ask of Protiviti or need any of their support, and if you didn't get this down, don't hesitate to reach out and be happy to connect you as well. This session also is recorded, so we'll be getting that posted to our website probably within about 48 hours. Give us a little bit of time to encode it. We like to close caption it and get it up there for you guys. So again, thank you everybody. Thanks Protiviti. It was a pleasure getting to put this event on with you guys today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.